branch on that?
Well, see, that's what I was saying, is what we have is kind of a schizophrenic thing going on, where Congress keeps passing laws trying to protect religious expression in some ways, and the Supreme Court is trying to kind of work the other way. And they've never quite sorted all of that out. But that's the problem that's going on. Okay. So, and then the other thing that Barton alluded to with the outsider test is if somebody feels like it makes them feel sort of like, gee, I must not really be an American because I don't agree with what's being said, therefore the expression has to stop. I mean, what it does is it puts the minority in control of the exercise of majority rights, which are expressly guaranteed by the Constitution.
Is that protected in other ways too? Because it seems like most of what we do in America tends to be a majority rule thing. I mean, we still think that we're a democracy and not a republic. I mean, most people don't quite understand any of that. So, I mean, if a whole bunch of people thought it was just fine to, I mean, if a small amount of people thought it was fine to cheat on their taxes, and it made them uncomfortable that most people were following the rules of their taxes, they can't just say, I'm sorry, I'm really uncomfortable with this. Or, you know, I know you just killed a whole bunch of children in a mass shooting thing, but I'm comfortable with that, and everyone else is uncomfortable. It's a weird, and yet they have this tiny little compartment of religion that they're allowed to do this outsider idea.
Well, and what David Barton was talking about, when he was talking about the outsider test, you know, 6% of the United States is professing atheist, and so if they don't want to hear it, if they say, gee, this makes me feel like an outsider in my own country. Now, what you got to remember is all these cases we're talking about didn't just happen. They were orchestrated. Okay? And we'll talk more about that as time goes on, but Americans United for Separation of Church and State is behind some of them. The ACLU is behind some of them. All the Ten Commandments cases you hear about, ACLU is pounding the drum on that with the help of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Okay, so they find people who say, gosh, I walked into a courthouse and there's the Ten Commandments, and I went, oh, I feel terrible. So the Ten Commandments got to come down. Okay, that's the de facto man on the street understanding of the Establishment Clause. And that's what all the cases, you know, the Ten Commandments have been upheld numerous times. So why do these groups keep coming at the Ten Commandments? Because they're trying to tear them down. You can't post the, I think it was the Abington versus Shemp case back in the early 1960s, said, you know what? If you have the Ten Commandments up in a classroom, kids might actually think about that stuff. Which means they might actually pray. Which means they might actually believe it. We can't have that. Okay, you understand what's going on. And there are very well-funded groups who are saying, yeah, that's right, that's right.
So the very conservative Christian people that believe in not compartmentalizing, you know, religion, we're a minority, and we're uncomfortable with it. And we're uncomfortable with the country that we live in that we say is our country, and yet we're uncomfortable with it. But it doesn't go the other way, where the conservative Christian population could say, it seems...
Well, what happens, and just to take the Ten Commandments displays, for example, ADF and other groups get, you know, oppose those cases. And what they do is say, guess what? We have a history that's based on the Ten Commandments. And most of the population believes that stuff. And just because somebody is offended doesn't mean it shouldn't be there. Because our laws are, you know, we get into all the historical stuff, and most of the time that works, but it probably does take, ultimately, a bunch of Christian people saying, you know what, I'm offended if it comes down. So therefore you can't take it down. Then what does the government do? Stephen?
Can someone explain to me the deep fascination of all people on pleasing minorities? The majority is more people. Don't you want to make more people happy? Not make less people happy.
No, I think you're missing a point, Stephen, and that is that all of this ultimately is used to attack God.
I understand that.
That's the point. And minorities are merely used as a tool to do that. And that's why the new Black Panther case was dismissed, was because blacks can't be racist, by definition.
Yeah.
Only whites can be racist.
And it was okay to kill Jews in Germany because Jews were legally not people, so therefore you weren't killing people if you killed them.
But there was already precedent for that back in.
But the point is, the law goes off the rails and defines things certain ways, and there you go. Nathan?
Some people saw this coming in the 1800s. A.A. Hodge wrote that if you try to have a public system of education where everyone has a stake in it, then necessarily he who believes in very little will have a say over him who believes more, until the person who believes nothing is setting the course. And so he said that the system of public education that was being proposed was going to become one of the most effective instruments for the propagation of atheism that the world had ever seen 150 years ago.
Now the other thing is, how many of you know that the U.S. Department of Education has actually issued guidelines that authorize religious expression in public schools?
What? Yeah, not for us.
Now listen, it happened under President Clinton, it happened again under President Bush. And you don't know about it?
That's your job.
No, it's not my job, it's everybody's job. So, why do we have so much controversy over religious expression in public schools if the U.S. Department of Education has spoken? Stephen?
The Department of Education is unconstitutional.
No, it's because what Doug said, there are people that are attacking God. They're not going to take no for an answer. Okay?
There is no God, but we're attacking him anyway.
So,
Nobody ever accused them of rationality.
this last week, the U.S. Supreme Court accepted certiorari on a case. It's an employment case. The Hosanna Tabor Evangelical Lutheran Church and School versus the EEOC. And the EEOC,
What's that?
Equal Employment Opportunity
Oh,
Commission.
okay.
Folks that make sure there's no discrimination. So, what we have here is a private school that, and the big issue is whether or not any of the non-discrimination and disability laws apply to a religious institution. Okay? And the reason why the U.S. Supreme Court accepted cert on this case is to address the question of whether, if you're a religious group, exactly how do you draw the lines in terms of what laws apply and which ones don't? Now, if you're talking, and what it boils down to is there are exceptions for what are called ministerial employees. Does our church have ministerial employees?
Yes.
Does our church have ministerial employees who are not pastors?
Yes.
How do you tell?
Whatever they
They
get
don't
away
have
with,
the
they
title.
don't. They're on the
How
payroll.
do you tell?
On the payroll.
How do you tell?
Whether they're paying FICA or not.
What are ministerial employees? They're people who advance the purpose for the organization. So how many ministerial employees work at Southwest Hills Baptist Church?
Everybody.
Okay, and the question is, if they're not ordained pastors, does the ministerial exemption apply to that employee? That's what this case is about.
So, in their mind, for example, if you are an American history teacher in a Christian school, that is not considered, that would not be considered a ministerial employee, or if you're a math teacher. If you're the Bible teacher, it might be.
Yeah.
But not if you're a math teacher or a history teacher or...
Because they're secular and religious, and the two never come together.
You know, Becky would not be probably considered a ministerial employee.
So the idea is the government is being called upon to determine who is an employee that's important to the ministry or the function of that religious organization. which, by the way, they're constitutionally prohibited from doing. There's something called the Church Autonomy Doctrine. But so the reason it's an important case is the Supreme Court will decide next term whether or not the government gets to decide who's a ministerial employee and who is not.